Spin Selling by Neil Rackham. Introduction. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Picture a cold, miserable January evening. A train is cutting through the darkness, but it's suddenly forced to a halt, swallowed by a thick, freezing fog. Inside one of the compartments, two strangers are stranded. One of them is a young researcher, just starting his own consulting business. The other is a salesman, and he looks defeated. He tells the young researcher, "I used to be a top performer for my last company, but now, I just can't seem to do anything right." You see, he had been the number 3 seller out of a force of 200, a true star, when he was selling low-priced products. But he'd moved to a new company to sell expensive, complex machine tools, and after a whole year, he was at the very bottom of the leaderboard. He looked at the researcher with desperation in his eyes and asked a question that would change the world of sales forever. How can you be successful in one sales job and fail entirely in another? The young researcher had no answer for him. Not then. But that question lit a fire in his mind. That researcher's name was Neil Rackham, and he would spend the next 12 years and over $1 million leading the largest research study in sales history to find the answer. His team at Huthwaite analyzed over 35,000 sales calls in 23 countries. They weren't interested in opinions or theories. They wanted cold, hard data. They wanted to know, what do the world's most successful salespeople actually do in major, high-stakes sales? The book we're exploring today, Spin Selling, is the answer to that salesman's question. It's not just another book on sales tactics, it's a revolutionary look at the science of selling. It has become the best validated sales method available today, used by more than half of the world's top 100 industrial corporations to train their teams. And today, I'm going to share with you the profound, and often surprising, secrets that Neil Rackham and his team uncovered. By the end of our time together, you will understand the fundamental difference between selling something small and selling something big, and you will have a powerful framework that can transform the way you persuade, influence, and connect with people, not just in sales, but in any area of your life where building value and trust is the key to success. This isn't about tricks or manipulation. It's about understanding the deep psychology of how people make major decisions. Book summary. So where did Neil Rackham begin this massive undertaking? Well, like many people, his first instinct was to find the top-performing salespeople and simply ask them for their secrets. It seems logical, right? If you want to be the best, learn from the best. But he quickly discovered a fascinating and frustrating truth. Top performers rarely know what makes them so effective. They often do things naturally, without even thinking about it. Rackham shares a brilliant story about his research team trying to figure out what made certain customs officers so good at catching smugglers. They interviewed 23 of the best agents, and 18 of them gave the exact same advice: it's all in the eyes. Look into people's eyes and you can see signs of guilt. So, they even set up training sessions where officers stared earnestly into each other's eyes, trying to spot guilt. As you can imagine, it was awkward and, more importantly, it didn't work at all. It was only when they stopped asking and started watching, using concealed cameras, that they discovered the truth. The successful officers weren't looking for signs of guilt, they were looking for signs of control. A guilty person tries too hard to act innocent, leading to subtle cues like a more upright posture or tighter neck muscles. The expert's own advice was completely wrong. This was a huge breakthrough. Rackham realized you can't learn a skill by interviewing experts. You have to observe them in action. And that's what his team did for the next decade. They became shadows in thousands of sales calls, not just listening, but meticulously coding every single behavior. They used a method called behavior analysis, tracking over 116 different actions to see which ones appeared more often in successful calls versus unsuccessful ones. And what they found turned the entire world of sales training on its head. For decades, sales training had been built on a few core pillars, ideas that were repeated in almost every book and seminar. Rackham's research didn't just question them. It proved that in large, complex sales, these pillars were actually causing people to fail. Let's start with the most sacred of them all, closing. The classic sales wisdom, the ABC of selling, was always be closing. Trainers taught dozens of clever techniques. The assumptive close, where you act as if the customer has already agreed. The alternative close, asking if they'd prefer delivery on Tuesday or Thursday. Or the standing room only close, where you create false urgency. The common belief, promoted by gurus, was that you should try to close at least 5 times in every call. Rackham was fascinated by this and fully expected his research to prove it right. But the data told a very different story. In one of their most telling experiments, they studied salespeople in a chain of photo shops. These sellers would work one day at a counter selling low-cost items like film, and the next day they'd sell expensive cameras and video equipment. It was the perfect setup to test how closing techniques worked as the size of the decision changed. After the salespeople were trained in classic closing techniques, here's what happened. When they were selling low-value goods, using more closes actually worked. It sped up the transaction, and sales went up slightly. But when those very same salespeople, using the very same techniques, moved to the high-value counter, the results were disastrous. Their success rate dropped from 42% down to 33%. The more they used closing techniques on an expensive item, the less likely they were to make the sale. Why? Because a major sale isn't a single event, it's a long-term relationship. A hard close puts pressure on the customer. While you might pressure someone into buying a roll of film, you can't pressure them into a $100,000 decision. The bigger the decision, the more negatively people react to pressure. Professional buyers, the gatekeepers of major sales, see these techniques for what they are: manipulative tricks. It destroys the professional respect and trust you're trying to build. The conclusion was undeniable. In major sales, classic closing techniques don't just fail to help, they actively hurt your chances of success. The second myth Rackham's research shattered was the idea of objection handling. Sales training has always put a huge emphasis on handling objections. The traditional wisdom was that objections are a sign of customer interest, and the more you get, the better. So, they taught salespeople clever ways to counter, rephrase, and overcome every objection a customer could possibly raise. But Rackham's team noticed something interesting. Less experienced salespeople got a ton of objections. The top performers? They got very few. This was a direct contradiction to the old advice. It turned out that objections weren't a sign of success. They were a sign of failure earlier in the call. The goal shouldn't be to get good at handling objections. It should be to get good at preventing them. So, what was causing all these objections? To understand this, we have to look at how salespeople traditionally talk about their products. They use what are called features and advantages. A feature is just a fact about your product. This car has a 2.0-liter engine. An advantage shows how that feature can help. The 2.0-liter engine gives you faster acceleration. Most sales training programs call these benefits and tell you to use a lot of them. But here's the problem. Imagine a seller says, "Our word processor would eliminate that retyping for you." That's an advantage. But the buyer is thinking, "Sure, we do some retyping, but I'm not paying $15,000 just for that," and so they object. The objection wasn't really about the product, it was about value. The seller offered a solution to a problem that didn't feel big enough to the customer. The more advantages you give, the more objections you create. You're treating a symptom, not the cause. The cause of most objections is offering solutions too early, before you've built up the value. So, if closing doesn't work, and objection handling is just a band-aid, what does work? Rackham found the answer in the most overlooked part of the sales call, the investigating stage. Almost every sales call can be broken down into 4 stages: the preliminaries, or opening; the investigating, where you ask questions; the demonstrating capability, where you present your solution; and obtaining commitment, where you agree on the next steps. Rackham's research proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that success in a major sale depends more than anything else on how you handle the investigating stage. For decades, the only real guidance on questioning was the difference between open and closed questions. A closed question gets a simple yes or no, while an open question requires a longer answer. The theory was that open questions were more powerful. Rackham's team tested this. They counted the use of open and closed questions in thousands of calls. And what they found was shocking. There was no measurable relationship between the use of open questions and success. Some top performers used almost no open questions. Others used nothing but. It made no difference. The entire foundation of questioning skills, taught for over 50 years, was essentially useless in predicting success in a major sale. This is where Rackham and his team had their biggest breakthrough. It wasn't the format of the question open or closed that mattered. It was the purpose. And the purpose of questions in a major sale, they discovered, is to uncover and develop customer needs. Here's the key. Needs in a small sale are different from needs in a big one. When you buy a candy bar, your need develops in about 2 seconds. But a major purchase, like a new computer system for your company, involves needs that develop slowly, over months or even years. Rackham's team made a crucial distinction. They divided needs into 2 types: implied needs and explicit needs. An implied need is a statement of a problem, a difficulty, or a dissatisfaction. It's the customer saying, "I'm unhappy with our wastage rates," or "our current system is a bit slow." An explicit need is a strong statement of a want or a desire. It's the customer saying, "We need a faster system," or "what we're looking for is a more reliable machine." Now, here is the $1,000,000 secret. In small, simple sales, uncovering implied needs is enough to be successful. The more problems you find, the more likely you are to make a sale. But in large, complex sales, there is no relationship between the number of implied needs you uncover and your success. It doesn't matter how many problems you find. What matters is what you do with them. The goal of the master salesperson is to take those small, nagging implied needs and develop them, build them up, until they become powerful, urgent, explicit needs. And how do they do that? They do it with a specific sequence of questions. This is the heart of Rackham's discovery, the legendary SPIN model. SPIN is an acronym for 4 types of questions, used in a logical sequence to develop customer needs. It starts with S, situation questions. These are questions about facts and background. What equipment are you using now? How many people do you employ? They are necessary to understand the context, but Rackham's research showed they have a slightly negative relationship with success. Why? Because they're boring for the customer. They only benefit the seller. Successful salespeople ask them sparingly, doing their homework beforehand and only asking what's essential. Once they have the context, they move to P, problem questions. These questions explore problems, difficulties, and dissatisfactions. Are you satisfied with your present equipment? What are the disadvantages of the way you're handling this now? These questions are the raw material of a sale. They uncover the implied needs. In small sales, this is often enough. But in a major sale, you're just getting started. This is where the less successful salespeople go wrong. They hear a problem, and they immediately jump in with a solution. But the master salespeople hold back. They know the problem isn't big enough yet. So they move to the third, and most powerful, type of question. I, Implication questions. Implication questions are about the consequences or effects of a problem. They take a small problem and explore its impact, making it bigger, more serious, and more urgent. This is the skill that more than any other separates the great salespeople from the average ones. Let's look at a brilliant example from the book. A seller is talking to a buyer about some machines. The seller asks a problem question: are they difficult for your operators to use? The buyer replies with a small implied need: they are rather hard, but we've learned how to get them working. An average seller would now offer a solution. But the spin seller starts asking implication questions. You say they're hard to use. What effect does that have on your output? The buyer admits it can create bottlenecks if an operator leaves. The seller digs deeper. It sounds like the difficulty of using these machines may be leading to a turnover problem. Is that right? The buyer starts to see the problem growing. Yes, people certainly don't like using them, and operators generally don't stay with us for long. The seller keeps going. What does that turnover mean in terms of training cost? Suddenly, the buyer is calculating thousands of dollars in wasted training. The seller asks about overtime costs to cover the bottlenecks, about the frustration of sending work outside and dealing with late deliveries. By the end of this chain of implication questions, the buyer's tiny problem, they are rather hard to use, has been transformed into a massive business crisis involving tens of thousands of dollars, production bottlenecks, and operator dissatisfaction. The buyer concludes, when you put it that way, those machines are creating a very serious problem indeed. Do you see the magic here? The seller didn't tell the buyer the problem was serious. He asked questions that helped the buyer discover the seriousness for himself. The value of the solution has just skyrocketed, not because the product changed, but because the perception of the problem changed. But there's one final step. Implication questions are powerful, but they can be a bit negative. They focus on pain and problems. To bring the conversation to a positive, solution-oriented place, successful salespeople use the fourth type of question. Need-payoff questions. Need-payoff questions ask about the value, usefulness, or utility of a solution. They get the customer to focus on the payoff. How would that help you? What would be the advantages of solving this problem? Is there any other way this could help? The psychology here is brilliant. Instead of the seller listing the benefits, need-payoff questions get the customer to tell you the benefits. For example, after uncovering the pain of the training costs, the seller might ask, so, if you had a machine that was easier to use and could cut down on that operator turnover, what would that allow you to do? The customer might reply, well, we could save over $25,000 a year, and our production would be much more reliable. The customer is now selling themselves on the solution. And even better, this process rehearses them for when they have to go and sell the idea to others inside their own company. They are now armed not with your product features, but with a clear understanding of how the solution will solve their business problems. And this brings us full circle. Once you have masterfully used the spin sequence to build a clear and urgent explicit need, the final two stages of the call become incredibly simple. When it's time for demonstrating capability, you don't spew a list of features or advantages. You present a benefit. And Rackham has a very specific and powerful definition for it. A true benefit is a statement that shows how your product or service meets an explicit need that the customer has expressed. The customer says, we need to reduce our training costs. You reply with a benefit. Our EasyFlow system will meet that need for you, because it's so simple to operate that it cuts training time by 80%. It's a perfect fit. And because it meets a need the customer already feels strongly, it doesn't create objections, it creates approval. And finally, obtaining commitment. You don't need tricky closing techniques. A customer who desperately wants a solution doesn't need to be closed, they need to be guided. The successful seller does three simple things. First, they check if there are any remaining concerns. Second, they summarize the benefits they've just discussed. And third, they don't ask for the order, they propose a commitment. They suggest a realistic, logical next step that moves the sale forward. Then could I suggest that the most logical next step would be for you and your accountant to come and see one of these systems in operation? It's not a push, it's a helpful suggestion. You're not closing a sale, you're opening a relationship. This, in essence, is the powerful, research-backed strategy of spin selling. It's a journey that begins not with your product, but with the customer's world. It starts with situation questions to understand their context, moves to problem questions to uncover their difficulties, uses implication questions to make those difficulties feel significant, and finally, uses need-payoff questions to let the customer discover the light at the end of the tunnel. It is a process of co-creation, where you and the customer build the value of the solution together. Commentary. When you truly step back and look at what Neil Rackham achieved with spin selling, it's more than just a sales methodology. It's a fundamental shift in how we think about persuasion and influence. For decades, selling was portrayed as an adversarial game, a battle of wits where the seller used clever tactics to get the customer to buy. It was about pushing a product, handling objections, and closing the deal. Rackham's research reveals a more profound and, frankly, more ethical path. It transforms the salesperson from a product pusher into a problem solver, from a tactician into a trusted advisor. The S-spin model isn't a set of tricks to manipulate someone into a decision. It's a framework for genuine curiosity. It's about having the discipline to understand before you try to be understood. The most powerful lesson in this book, for me, is the idea that you can't convince people of anything. All you can do is ask the right questions that allow them to convince themselves. When you ask an implication question, you aren't telling the customer their problem is expensive, you are guiding them to that conclusion on their own. When you ask a need-payoff question, you aren't telling them how great your solution is, you're creating a space for them to articulate its value in their own words. This is persuasion at its most powerful because it respects the other person's intelligence and autonomy. It builds trust, not resistance. In a world that is noisier and more skeptical than ever, where buyers are more educated and have more choices, the hard sell tactics of the past are not just ineffective, they're obsolete. The principles of spin selling, building value, understanding needs, and creating collaborative solutions are more relevant today than they were when the book was first written. This approach is what builds lasting customer relationships and turns transactions into partnerships. So, how can you start putting this into practice today? Let me offer 3 simple actions. First, before your next important conversation, whether it's with a client, a boss, or even a family member, stop thinking about what you're going to say. Instead, spend 10 minutes thinking about what you're going to ask. Write down one potential problem they might be facing. Then, try to brainstorm 3 implication questions related to that problem. What are the consequences? The ripple effects? And finally, write down one need-payoff question. How would solving that problem help them? This simple planning exercise will fundamentally shift your focus from telling to asking. Second, for the next week, just focus on one single behavior from this book. Don't try to master everything at once. Maybe you decide to simply ask more problem questions. Just get comfortable asking people about their difficulties and dissatisfactions. Don't worry about getting it perfect. As Rackham says, focus on quantity before quality. Do it often enough, and the quality will take care of itself. Third, listen to yourself. In your next conversation, pay attention to the balance of talking versus listening. Are you jumping in with solutions the moment you hear a problem? If you are, just notice it. The first step to changing any behavior is becoming aware of it. Spin selling is more than a book, it's a new way of thinking. It's a reminder that the most effective way to influence others is not by having the best answers, but by asking the best questions. That was a summary of Spin Selling by Neil Rackham. We've certainly covered the big ideas today, but a summary is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. It gives you the layout, but it can't give you the feeling of walking the streets, smelling the air, and meeting the people. The true power of this book is in the details, the dozens of real-world examples, and the way the ideas build on one another. This summary is your map, to help you see if this is a journey you want to take. If anything we've discussed has sparked your curiosity or made you rethink your own approach, I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning tactics, it's about fundamentally changing how you see your role in any conversation where value is being created. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It lets me know that these deep dives are helpful, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another one of the transformative books that have shaped the minds of the world's most successful people. Let's keep learning and growing together.